Welcome to Roots and Resonance, a journey into sacred traditions, ancestral wisdom, and the healing arts. Join me as we sit with elders, spiritual luminaries, and wisdom keepers to uncover stories that bridge heaven and earth, the mundane and the magical. May these conversations ground you in your roots and awaken the resonant song that lives within us all. Welcome to the Roots and Resonance podcast. My name is Reverend Ryan Edmonds, and today I'm honored to speak with Damon Leff, whose work explores the emergence of Neo-Paganism in South Africa, the reclaiming and de-stigmatisation of words such as witch and witchcraft, and his important work in advocacy and law, religion, and social justice. Damon, like myself, is one of the members of the executive committee of the South African Pagan Council, and he has worked for many decades to fight for the rights of religious minorities in South Africa. I hope you enjoy this interview. So, welcome to Damon Leff. Damon is an esteemed member of the South African Pagan Council. He's on the Execo board, and he's also the director of the South African Pagan Rights Alliance, among many other wonderful things that he does. And I will link more details to Damon's bio in the show notes of this podcast. So, Damon, welcome and thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Ryan. It's nice to chat with you.
Damon, where do you live at the moment?
I'm situated on the Escape, just between George and Knysna, above Wilderness.
Western Cape. And was there a specific reason that you gravitated to that area?
Well, my current partner, we've been together for 18 years, I think. We met in Johannesburg. That's where we were both living. And he'd gone to England for a couple of months, and when he came back, he decided, well, he can't live in Johannesburg anymore. He wants to live here. He'd been here before on holiday. There's a famous ferry, no hotel, backpackers. So, of course, I followed. I had nothing to keep me in Johannesburg. At the time, I'd given up the work that I was doing. And we came down here and we lived as hippies for a couple of months until we found our feet. And we've never regretted it and never gone.
It sounds like a pagan paradise, though, being so in the nature there.
It is, I would describe it as paradise because we have the mountains on one side and the sea on the other side. And we live directly between them. We got surrounded by forest. And the area that isn't forested is grassland and cows. So it kind of reminds me of this idyllic Celtic setting with the wild cows. Yeah.
Do you have Celtic heritage yourself?
Yes. My father can trace his ancestry back to Poland. My mother traced her ancestry back to Ireland. So there is some Celtic heritage there. My stepbrother recently did his DNA, researched his DNA study, and he identified the Isle of Man as being prominent in his genetic makeup. But remember, we have the same father but different mothers, so we're not sure whether it comes from his mother or his father's side. But I think that's partly why I'm interested or drawn to Celtic mythology and European mythology. Of course, the Celts were Europeans. You know, they were not. They didn't start off in England. They started off in Europe. So, yeah, that's the attraction for me. There is also a strong Slavic root on my father's side, so I'm very interested in the Slavic mythologies as well. At the moment, not fashionable because it means that you sort of support the Russian ideology. I don't. At the moment, no.
So, Damon, before we get into all the amazing work that you've done for religious freedom and for pagan rights in South Africa, I was wondering if you would feel comfortable sharing a little bit about your personal journey and maybe even what first drew you to the path of paganism and witchcraft, or if you identify as a witch. Maybe you can clear that up for us.
So yes, I identify as a witch. Publicly, I simply identify as a pagan because it's a lot easier than having to explain, especially because there is still so much misunderstanding around the terms. But I personally identify as a witch. My interest in that, I think, goes back to high school, discovering books in Johannesburg Public Library on witch hunts in Salem. Just, I was influenced by Eastern philosophy because my father was interested in Eastern philosophy. So I was already, I would say, outside of the mold of the Christian fascist state. And I was looking for something new, looking for something that was meaningful to me personally. I've always loved nature in one form or another. And I couldn't reconcile, it took me a long time to reconcile the historical tales of Salem witch hunts and the description of witches as evil, barbaric, devil worshippers with what I intuitively felt was a sense of reverence between the practitioner, magical practitioner, and nature. But that led me to a wild investigation around magical practices and witchcraft. The Malleus Maleficarum, 3 books of occult philosophy. Those 2 were very influential for me before I left school. One, of course, depicting the witch as the embodied servant or slave of the devil, the Christian devil. The other, of course, giving an entirely different perspective of what the magical tradition was in Europe. Yes, my discovery of the Salem witchcraft trials in public libraries led me on a quest to explore that part of history. But it also led me to discover things like the Malleus Maleficarum by Heinrich Kramer and the way in which the church negatively stereotyped and characterized witches and practitioners of magic generally, not just witches, which I instinctively knew was not the whole story, Later on, I discovered the 3 books of occult philosophy, Agrippa. And of course, that opened up a whole new window for me. That clearly put Kramer's perspective, misogynist perspective, on women in context. So I think that's where it started. After school, of course, my first encounter with, I think it was probably meeting Duncan Houghton was my first encounter with other pagans, because I hadn't actually used the term pagan to identify who I was. I was still identifying myself as a witch, but privately. I hadn't told anybody because it wasn't something that you had conversations about at that time, not when I was in school, certainly. So meeting Duncan was great because we were able to talk about our common approach to religion, to magic. He, of course, was interested in Druidry. And then after that, we met Shannon Candy at, gosh, I can't even remember the name of the lady who was giving magical classes at the time. I think she may have been the lady responsible for steering Donna Darkwolf Foss into witchcraft, into paganism as well. So we met them at that time in, where was it? Somewhere in Johannesburg. And we became friends. And then eventually that led to the formation of a coven, the Grove, a couple of years later. So that's how my journey led me to where I am now.
And Damon, that's such a lovely backstory, and you identify as a witch, you practice witchcraft. If somebody was listening to our conversation for the first time and that word was triggering for them, or they didn't understand what we were talking about, how would you kind of explain or give more solid educational information on what we're talking about?
Mm. So essentially for me, a witch is a magical practitioner. It's just another word to describe a sort of magical practitioner who approaches magic in an exclusively particular way. For me, it's the practice of sympathetic magic. That's how I describe or identify witchcraft, the practice of sympathetic magic. For some people, it could be a religious thing. So for example, I see Wiccans as approaching sympathetic magic, but in a religious way, using gods and goddesses. So religion becomes an aspect of, for witchcraft, rather, anthropology has always attempted to separate magic from religion. And I've always felt that was wrong, because if we look back at ancient Greek religion or ancient Roman religion, magic and religion were very much united, or the one served the other. To worship an ancient Greek or Roman god was to perform a magical ritual. You presented offerings of certain kinds. You said sacred magic words. They weren't separated in the mind of the ordinary practitioners. It's only later on, when Christianity attempted to separate the practice of magic from what they understood as religion, that we get that definite attempt to divorce one from the other, but they're not. So for me, the practice of witchcraft is a way to commune or communicate with nature in a more meaningful way. Certain words, certain practices, certain plant associations, these things make my relationship with nature more meaningful. That for me is what witchcraft is.
And for you, you mentioned that there's a magical aspect. There could potentially be a religious aspect. Is witchcraft for you a religion? Is it a spirituality? Is it a practice? Or is it a mixture of all of it?
I think it's a mixture of all of it, because I still see the word religion as limiting. Religion is an attempt to limit our experience or understanding of the universe. So religion is part of it. But for me, the word magic is much greater than religion. One could be a practitioner of magic without necessarily believing in any god or goddess, which excludes the religious aspect. For example, if I attempt to communicate with a tree spirit in order to harness its essence, its magical essence, in order to perform some kind of act, I'm not necessarily going to invoke a god or a goddess. I'm going to speak directly to the tree. So it's tree spirit and human spirit communicating. That for me is very sacred. Again, religion for me is a very personal thing.
And
so
mm,
so I find it very difficult
has
to.
your relationship with carry on?
No, has my relationship with.
So for you, it's a relationship. Witchcraft is a relationship between you and the spiritual world as manifest through nature. Is that correct?
Precisely. Yes. That's a good description. Yes.
It feels very personal when you speak like that. It feels to me like it's a one-on-one connection, and you're basing this relationship on direct experience rather than what someone else is telling you what to believe.
Yes, definitely. I mean, I've always said, if you buy a book written by a magical practitioner and you are intending to use that book to guide you in your own practice, you have to remember that this is that magical practitioner's experience. It's not going to be your experience. Sometimes you might find similar experiences in similar practices, but it's not your experience. Every individual magical practitioner has their own personal relationship with the world around them. And that's why we should celebrate the diversity in magical practitioners. We're all different. We all approach the universe in different ways. And that's great. That's exactly the way it should be. I'm very anti-orthodox approaches to magic, which is why the Western magic tradition generally leaves me with because everybody's expected to say the same thing, do the same thing, look the same way. And that just doesn't work for me.
I love that, Damon. You and I have known each other for many years, but not directly, just through the interweaving of the magical web of the pagan community in South Africa. And one thing I've always really respected and recognized is that I've seen that you have a pivotal role to play in paganism in South Africa. And I'd be interested to know, what has it been like being a pagan in South Africa, walking through that journey, post-apartheid South Africa, religious freedom, constitutional rights of all religions. You've been a part of that, and I don't think many people know the history or the journey that paganism has been on in South Africa. Would you like to touch a little bit on your journey as a pagan in South Africa, and a little bit on what road have we walked to get where we are?
So I think phenomenally everything changed in our favor in 1994 with the publication of the interim constitution, which for the first time in this country expressly said, regardless of what your religious belief system is, you are going to be treated equally. And it was the first time. You see, during the apartheid years, the government didn't expressly say only Christians are allowed. But in practice, it favored Christian religion. It did so by uniting itself through the Dutch Reformed Church with Christianity expressly. It used Christianity to justify apartheid. So in that sense, it didn't really discriminate against you if you were a Jew or a Muslim or a Hindu or a pagan, if there was such a thing outwardly, publicly at the time. The government didn't actually discriminate against you, but it also didn't offer you the same protection and equal opportunity as it did for Christians. If you were a Christian, you were automatically advanced in society. You only needed to say, I am a Christian for whatever you did to be favored by the society in which you were. So post 1994, and then with 1996, the actual constitution, the state had to re-look at the way in which it treated people generally. For example, you had the occult police who used its Christian dominance to target religious minorities that it felt were a threat to the status quo. It didn't matter what those religious minorities were in practice. There was no law on the statute book that said practicing this kind of religion makes you a criminal. So that's the status that I grew up in. If you publicly announced that you were a pagan in certain sectors of the community, it was fine. If you were to do so publicly, you might be shamed, you might be sneered at. But there was no outward discrimination because there was no law in the statute book that said you had to be discriminated against. Unless, of course, you were a Satanist, whatever that meant at the time, because there weren't any organized groups of Satanists. There wasn't a satanic church. It was whatever Donker Jonker thought at the time was a threat to his personal religious belief systems that he targeted. With the, I want to just I found a perfect quotation earlier. Blah, blah. You'll have to edit this out.
I remember.
Yes,
I
S.V.
remember that was
Lawrence.
Colonel Cobus Jonker. Is that right?
That's right. Yes. So in 1997, a case in the Constitutional Court called S.V. Lawrence was the first court case in this country where the right to freedom of religion was actually articulated. The question was, what does the right to freedom of religion actually mean in the new South Africa? And essentially, the court found that the right to entertain any religious beliefs that a person chooses was permissible. That meant the right to declare your religious beliefs openly, without fear or hindrance of reprisal. And you had the right to manifest your religious beliefs by worship or practice. You could teach, you could disseminate religious identities or doctrines that prior was not accepted by the government. So that's it seems like such a small thing, a single section in the Constitution that guarantees freedom of religion, but it changed the way in which we communicated with each other and with the state, and it changed the way in which the state behaved with us. Because after that, the occult community, the occult crimes unit couldn't exist, because in existing, it contradicted that very section, freedom of religion. There was no distinction, freedom of religion, but there was no such distinction.
For those who've never heard of the occult crime unit in South Africa, can you give us a brief little overview of that? One day we're going to go in a little bit deeper into the advocacy around witchcraft, but maybe for those who've never heard of it.
Well, essentially, the unit was established by Cobus Jonker, and his goal was to. It's very odd. His goal was to bring salvation to people who had embraced alternative faiths or non-Christian faiths, essentially. But what he was doing was looking at crimes that he could not understand in the African traditional sense, Muti murders, for example. And he was attempting to apply a Western ideology onto that by labeling Muti murders satanic, when in fact the practitioners of Muti murders were not Satanists at all. They were rogue traditional healers who were selling body parts for use in magical preparations in order to bring about certain conditions, whether it was healing or cursing, or it had no context within the European concept of Satanism. So from the beginning, he was doomed to fail, because there was no definitive description that suited reality. In his mind, if you were not a Christian, your only salvation was to find Jesus. Well, that's not what police are supposed to be doing. Police are supposed to be identifying crimes and solving them, not proselytizing. That's in a nutshell. But yes, it's a very interesting subject. It has been exhaustively examined and unpacked by Francisco Fumarola, who was an executive member of SAPRA. He's our chair. And Tristan Kapp, who is a doctor in theology, and he's done quite a bit of study on Satanism in South Africa and the role of the occult crime unit. So that's worth exploring. because it's essentially where all of us started, under the South African Pagan, what was it, the Federation, Pagan Federation, the first South African Pagan Federation, attempted to distance itself from Satanism because Cobus Jonker and the Occult Crime Unit simply saw us as an extension of Satanists. They did not initially identify pagans as a separate group from Satanists. They wanted to lump us all together and treat us all equally.
Now, Damon, the words witch and witchcraft carry sometimes very heavy and very dangerous connotations, not just in a European context, but now overlaid into an African context. What does it mean to reclaim those terms, witch and witchcraft?
Well, yeah, you have to challenge centuries of essentially storytelling, myth-making, groups of people sitting around a pot of beer talking about the evil that so-and-so did to so-and-so. Storytelling. No actual identified facts. No court-produced evidence of harmful magical practices. Just storytelling. And that storytelling is profound. It's also extremely powerful. It's not just African, it's European. We brought many of those stories with us. But we spoke earlier about the Slavic mythology in Baba Yaga, the most fearful, frightful concept of a witch or a witch goddess. Those stories are still being told today, in part to make children fearful of going into the woods on their own, but also fearful of straying away from the church in case, So those stories are meant to impose prejudice against the out of bounds, the people who were not inside the church, not inside the community. We still see that happening in towns across South Africa, where certain people are identified as being outside of the community for various reasons. They may behave in a strange way. They may be irrational in the way they approach certain things. I remember an incident where an old lady's son was killed in a car accident, and the neighbors simply couldn't understand or couldn't accept that this boy had been killed in a car accident. It must have been somebody's fault. It wasn't. Accidents don't just happen. It's either the ancestors who come out with you, it's God who's punishing you, or it's the mother who cursed her son. And if you can't prove one or two, it must be the mother who cursed her son, because at least you can take action against the mother. You can't take action against the ancestors, and you can't take action against God. And that's what happens repeatedly again and again and again. We find the victims most often are old women who find it very difficult in their power relations within communities to struggle, to fight back, to challenge the storytelling that's happening around them. So that also means challenging the storytelling that has entered into law. We adopted the British Witchcraft Suppression Act, and those stories are still told in law. We're told that certain acts are illegal because they're associated with witchcraft. Funnily enough, in neither the British Witchcraft Suppression Act nor the South African version of it is witchcraft actually defined, which is shocking, because in law the principle of legality requires that if Parliament decides that a certain act is unlawful, it must clearly define that act. That act must be defined in detail, so that you can't accidentally accuse someone of something that they didn't do. Well, witchcraft has never been clearly defined. Not in any way in the Act does the word get defined. It gets defined in stories only. For example, pointing out a witch. It's the story that the traditional healer or the diviner is telling about someone else that they have no personal knowledge of, but they're saying, yes, your misfortune is the cause of that old lady over there because she did whatever. Or it's you taught someone how to curse someone else in the acts. You're not allowed to tell people how to perform acts of witchcraft. So again, it's the stories you tell that become criminalized. Now, more recently, with the Law Reform Commission's review of the Witchcraft Suppression Act, various stakeholders who commented on the act attempted to incorporate Muti murders again into the act, because apparently witches are Muti murderers, or Muti murderers are witches. Stories, challenge the commission to find evidence that any Muti murder identified themselves as a witch or identified what they did as practicing witchcraft, and you won't find it because it didn't happen. It's the story that we tell that makes us feel like we're in control of a situation that we don't know anything about. So that's what we're challenging continuously. With SAPRA, most of our work has been challenging narratives in the media. With the Occult Crime Unit, we challenged the Occult Crime Unit's narratives, the stories they were telling. Those were the harmful acts. The same with witchcraft accusations. Sorry, you have to tell me to stop when you want to intervene.
No. I love where you're going with it. It's bringing up so many great questions that I'm sure our listeners are also thinking of. When Damon speaks of SAPRA, that's the South African Pagan Rights Alliance, and we're going to get into that just now. But what I really want to ask you, Damon, is, my major was in psychology, but I also studied anthropology. I love human culture. I was raised a witch, a Wiccan. I am a trained Sangoma, and so I have one foot in two different worlds. Having grown up in a kind of like with the Eurocentric understanding of a witch as a white person in the 21st century, I felt like I was always having to kind of destigmatize the European understanding of witchcraft and of what I practice and what I stand for. And I'm always fighting from a young age and telling people I'm not a Satanist, I'm not sacrificing babies or animals, or all these stigmas that they have. And then I had never plugged into the African concept of what a witch might be. And only once I was staying in Mpumalanga and hearing words like Mtagati, which has been translated into a European understanding of what a witch could be, a practitioner of dark arts, black magic, evildoer. Because we must understand that the concept of a witch is a European concept, and now it's been overlaid into an African concept of a person who also works with black magic and who gets up to mischief. But now the word has been linked in. Is that correct? It's been kind of joined, and now an African concept has been connected with a European. How I mean, now we've got to work on education on many levels, because now we've got to say, no, a witch is not a witch, and people go, but that doesn't make sense. A witch by definition is a mischief maker who practices evil deeds. What else could they be? In your work in advocacy now, in an African context, how are you seeing people taking that and going, it's impossible that a witch can be a nature-worshipping lover of good things in life, and we had mysteries of the universe.
We had exactly that. Yeah, we had exactly that complication with the THO, the Traditional Healers Organization, when the review of the Witchcraft Suppression Act started, we were invited to attend the Law Reform Commission in Pretoria, and it was myself representing SAPRA. There was 2 people representing the Pagan Council and 2 people representing the Traditional Healers Organization. And Pefasili Maseko was the spokesperson for the THO at the time. And I remember before the actual meeting in Pretoria, we had negotiated with one another on this subject. And I say negotiated because it really took a give and take, understanding what is your concept, what is my concept, our worldviews coming together. What can we agree on? What can we not agree on? And in several radio interviews on, I think it was FM radio. I think it was FM radio. I can't remember because it was so long ago. She had twice said very clearly that her and the traditional healers no longer wanted to make accusations against witches. But she meant European witches, Wiccans, the kind that you and I understand. She said that she realized that those witches were not responsible for the harm that they saw in their communities. But within a couple of months from that, she was in the newspaper talking about the Umtagat. But she didn't use the word Umtagat. She used the word witch, making accusations of witchcraft against witches. And I think she had more difficulty trying to come to terms with the fact that she was trying to identify an unidentifiable evil in her own community. Simply reached for the closest word that you could use to label that unidentified evil, witch, because in her mind, Umtagat and witch are the same thing. And the same thing applies across Africa, in every single African country. Take, for example, Nigeria. Now I can't remember his name. It's going to come to me soon. A Nigerian activist who has worked against witchcraft accusations in his own country, who I have a lot of respect for because he really has gone out of his way to make his own life a misery in order to speak for disenfranchised women across Nigeria and disenfranchised children, essentially, because the child accusations in Nigeria is a huge thing. We don't see that much in South Africa. It's mostly targeting women, older women. But in Nigeria, children are targeted as witches. Innocent children are targeted as witches. We have to put that. So his way of dealing with the issue is to say to the media and to his government and to the people of Nigeria, witchcraft doesn't exist. The witch does not exist. What you're saying is not true. You're falsely accusing people of something that they are not. And I get it. That's the only way to challenge it within his context. But by saying that, he's actually lying, because Europe is full of witches. America is full of witches. South Africa is full of witches. People are saying we practice witchcraft. We are witches. That conflict of ideologies is still there. It still exists. And there's no way that we can undo that without either side giving up what they believe. Now, I've been arguing all along that the Commission is attempting to give equal voice to anyone who has an objection against the repeal of the Witchcraft Suppression Act. People who feel that, no, we can't repeal the Witchcraft Suppression Act because witchcraft is real and it's affecting our communities. And look, we can tell you many stories, we can tell you many stories about how witchcraft is affecting our communities. And if we get rid of this act, how can we stop it? They forget that, one, the Witchcraft Suppression Act specifically says you cannot make accusations of witchcraft. So the act is not going to help them resolve their fears of the unidentified evil in their midst. But it is such a powerful belief that they can't just give it up.
Damon, not many people, and I think I would be confident enough to say not even many of the people who might end up hearing this podcast interview know that paganism is, and all the different traditions that are identified under the banner of paganism, is actually a legitimate, recognized religion in South Africa. And although I want to get to the Witchcraft Suppression Act just now, because I think that's so important in the advocacy you do, people are still equating, even if they're listening to this conversation, they're thinking of a pagan or a witch as someone who is a non-believer or a heretic. So would you give us just a brief definition maybe on what is paganism in a South African context even, or a European context, and maybe just remove a bit of the stigma before we proceed?
So, I did make a note here, which was important. Right. So, paganism in South Africa is, firstly, there has never been any recorded census taken for paganism. So we don't actually know how many pagans are in the country. For all we know, it could be the 2,000 people on Facebook, and that's it. And it could be a much larger community of people who identify as pagan, but don't openly express to their friends or family that they are pagans. Most pagans in this country will simply identify as pagans, but that means that they belong to one of several pagan religions. So paganism, essentially Neo-Paganism, is the rebirth of ancestral European pagan religions. That's essentially what it is. That's where the term comes from. It comes from the Roman term pagani, which simply meant countryside or person who lived in the country. And if you look back in context, a person who lived in the country in Rome believed in the gods of Greece, Rome, Egypt, depending on where they came from. They could have been Jews. They could have wandered in from Israel and been living in the countryside. And so they were pagani. So it incorporated an enormous amount of people, enormous variety of different religious identities. Today in South Africa, we have pagans who identify clearly as Wiccans. So they embrace the philosophy of Gerald Gardner, and one of the Wiccan streams that flow from Gerald Gardner's influence, or they might identify as British traditional witches. In other words, they might look at the influence of pagan mythology on local Celtic history or Asatruan history or heathen history, because all of those groups eventually invaded British culture, let's put it that way. Or here we might also see pagans identify as Druids, as Asatru, as heathen. I've found very few, but there are pagans who identify as Kemetic practitioners, one of which is an executive member of the Pagan Council. So essentially, paganism is a pagan religion that can find its origin in pre-Christian or post-Christian Europe, and that is being revived in one form or another. The revival of pagan religions isn't necessarily authentic. In other words, it doesn't look like paganism is practiced in ancient Greece or ancient Rome. But the gods are included, the mythology is adopted, and so it's a rebirth of an ancient belief system, or belief systems, rather. We should actually refer to paganisms rather than paganism. Heathens, Asatru, and Germanic pagans don't necessarily identify with the term pagan. They might use the term heathen instead of the term pagan. But we incorporate them under the term pagan in South Africa. Hope
Thank
that
you, thank you.
explained.
It's helpful because
They
I mean,
they have
even
they have a
yes,
common
yes,
the common factors between all of them, because they are very different. I mean, the belief systems of heathens and pagans and Wiccans are extremely different, and yet they share common factors: a reverence for nature, or a reverence for a god or a goddess that represents aspects of nature. The incorporation of magic and religion in their practices. The one serves the other. Magical rituals are essentially religious rituals. So these factors are common. Also, the fact that perhaps they are identified as isolated and minority faiths, that also brings them together under one umbrella. It would be easier for European pagans to stand under the same umbrella, whereas African pagans don't feel the need to stand under the European pagan umbrella. So I once chatted with Pefasidi about whether or not she identified as a pagan, because after all, she's not a Christian, and she practices an indigenous African religious belief system. So I asked her if she identified as a pagan too, and she said, no, that's a European term. We don't need the European term. And she doesn't need it because her belief system is a majority one. It's not a minority one. So I think perhaps we cling to the word pagan because our belief systems are minority, because we are such small groups of people that we find strength in that commonality.
yeah, that's a beautiful description. You personally are the director of a registered non-profit organization. We mentioned earlier SAPRA, or the South African Pagan Rights Alliance.
Yeah.
And you also sit on the executive board of the SAPC, the South African Pagan Council. Can you tell us a little bit more about these organizations and the work that they do for religious minorities in South Africa?
So both the South African Pagan Rights Alliance and the South African Pagan Council are designated religious organizations in terms of the Civil Union Act. Now, the Civil Union Act was passed in 2006, which enabled for the first time ever same-sex unions. But it also enabled non-Christian religious marriage officers to be appointed. And under the Civil Union Act, marriages can be sanctified between both same-sex couples and alternate-sex couples. Both organizations, the Pagan Council and SAPRA, appoint our own marriage officers. Of course, they're not appointed by us; they're nominated by us. Then they have to do an examination with Home Affairs, and if they pass the examination, they get designated marriage officers under the organizations, under SAPRA or the Pagan Council. Ultimately, we are responsible for their behavior, and we take responsibility for the work that they do. Let's see. The Pagan Alliance is also registered with the Companies and Intellectual Property Commission as a non-profit company, and we were recently designated as a tax-exempt public benefit organization with SARS. So although we charge nominal membership fee, 100 Rand a year, annual membership fee, it is now tax deductible. So hopefully that will encourage members to support our operational costs. What else do we do? We apart from challenging discrimination and challenging narratives, those stories that we hate so much, we also train paralegals. We train community paralegals. So every year we have a 6-month free course for community paralegals. It was originally established to train pagans to be able to deal with any religious discrimination issues which came up in their communities. We now incorporate a lot of non-pagan individuals who feel that perhaps they need more information on civics, perhaps they need to know how their government works, they need to involve themselves in their own personal community affairs, And so they need more information. They can get free information from us. We give them a certificate of attendance. It's not an accredited course. It won't entitle them to practice law at all, but it will educate them on what they need to know when challenging religious or civil discrimination.
Wow, I didn't know that. That's really, really phenomenal, and I think that's something quite profound and very beneficial for anyone who has an interest in freedom of religion, and I think, especially, I'd like to ask you your opinion, Damon, on, you were speaking about registered marriage officers, and what is the importance of the clergy or the priesthood of paganism taking more of a religious role as spokespeople, do you think, in South Africa? I know we have many priests and priestesses of different pagan denominations who are focused within their groups on the religious and spiritual aspects. But do you think there's a need for the priesthood of paganism to also be more outward going about education and playing more role in government?
Oh, definitely. I agree with that completely. One thing that we've noticed is that although we have achieved equality in the legal sense, in a social sense, we're still not seen. We're not heard. For example, interfaith councils. There are loads of interfaith councils all over the country. And we've often written to them and said, could we participate? We're pagans, we represent these people, we would like to participate, we would like to contribute to whatever work that you're doing. There are interfaith councils that focus on the environment, the interfaith councils that focus on charity work, and generally you see Jewish and Christian interfaith councils very, very actively doing this. They've been doing this for a very long time. So they're also not willing to open their doors to, perhaps they don't know who we are. Perhaps that's why they don't want pagans to join interfaith councils. Well, in my mind, an interfaith council must include members of diverse religious groups. The National Interfaith Council, I think that's still run by the president, has Muslims and Hindus on it, but it doesn't have any pagans. So we've been encouraging that all along. It would be amazing if the Pagan Council could somehow have its voice heard by these interfaith councils. With clergy is extremely important because it gives members of a particular belief system focus, guidance, help when needed. And of course, we can't just expect Wiccan clergy to serve Asatrus and Chemetics. Each pagan religion needs to evolve and develop their own clergy. And that might look very different. Wiccan clergy is going to look very different to Asatru clergy. But we're not seeing any attempt by all of these groups to develop clergy. We are seeing some indications amongst Wiccans because primarily of the influence by America. What is that group that started their seminary in America? Names gone. So there is an attempt to create a Wiccan seminary to train Wiccan clergy, and that I think is very, very important. They're going to have to ultimately deal with questions of what is witchcraft, what does witchcraft mean within community, and are these people who identify as Wiccans witches? Are these people who identify as witches Wiccans? These are the questions they're going to have to deal with. I don't know what that's going to look like for Druids or Asatrans or heathens, because I haven't seen any development on that front. But it's still early. There might be. I think that's the role that the Pagan Council
You know,
should be.
one thing that I agree, and I think even some kind of even before I was an executive member of the South African Pagan Council, I had discussions with Morgos, who was one of the founding members, who I said, you know, is there a need for standardized seminary in South Africa? And she actually mentioned that you and her were working on something like that many years ago, like a training for marriage officers and a training for pagan priesthood.
Sorry.
And no, please don't worry about it. Would you like to get some water?
No, it's fine.
You could.
So yes, I actually remember that.
So do you think that would be helpful? You know, an interesting thing with pagans, Damon, is I read somewhere someone, I think it was Maxine Sanders or Alex Sanders, and they said witches are all chiefs and no Indians.
Yes.
You know, in other words, like everybody's a priest and everybody's a priestess of their specific path. And many people are attracted to paganism because they're trying to escape congregational religion.
Yes.
They don't want to be a sheep anymore. They want to be autonomous. And do you think that could be one of the reasons why we don't have formalized priesthoods, especially in South Africa, where by nature we are very individualistic people?
I think you're spot on there. Absolutely. I mean, personally, I am an individualist first. So for me, I regard pagans as their own priests and priestesses, regardless of who they are or which pagan religion they belong to. Yes, I think ultimately it's going to come down to individuals who feel drawn to that profession, because it is a profession. You're going to have to be drawn to wanting to be there for other people, to minister to other people, regardless of whether or not those people congregate around you as the center of their faith. You know, you don't necessarily have to be the center of a faith in order to minister to a group, to serve a group. So maybe in that sense, religious professionals are going to look slightly different. We're not going to be wearing the robes, standing at the pulpit, preaching to a choir. You know, we might be sitting in the pulpit. I mean, sitting down on a bench next to an old person, helping them hear, for example. I'm just trying to give you a sense of what we might look like. And I think that's what's happening now.
Yes.
At the moment, pagans cooperate when there's common purpose. Like when there's a common threat, for example, when the Mpumalanga Witchcraft Suppression Bill was published. Pagans came out of the woodwork across the country to write letters objecting to the Mpumalanga Bill. People we hadn't heard from before. So when there is a need, pagans do come together as individuals, which is great. That's fine. I'm happy with that. As long as at some point they find common ground and they work together to find a solution to their common problems, that's okay. I'm very nervous when a group or a person says to me, we want to form a pagan clergy in order to control or dominate pagans in the country. We want all pagans under our umbrella. I'm very nervous about that kind of thing. The Pagan Council has been very, very clear. It's a round table. There's no head on the round table. We're sitting there with different people from different backgrounds, different belief systems, trying to find common purpose. And that's all we can do, is find common purpose. If what I can do can help you in your common purpose, then great. Then, you know, we have a mutual relationship of benefit for both of us. I think that's ultimately what clergy should be.
I love that, Damon. Yeah, for me personally, I tend to think of myself as just the person who has to keep revving the engine and keep the engine running for my community. That's really what my
Right.
role as a priest of this religion comes down to. Nothing fancy. It's just I'm the one who's constantly saying, "Hey, let's gather, let's get together, let's train, let's workshop, let's communicate, let's connect." I feel like I'm more of just an engine runner than anything else.
Mm. Mm. Yes, facilitator.
and I
That's
think
what we are. We are
a
facilitators.
facilitator completely. Yeah. Somebody who's called to service, as you say, and who is always there to hold up the torch. Pagan priesthood for me is very beautiful. It always has been, because it shouldn't be about ego. It shouldn't be about hierarchy. It should be about someone who's willing to be there when other people need them, and to lead and to be a representative or even a custodian of ancestral wisdom, just a bearer of the torch for a time.
Yes, I agree with you. I'm fully with you, yes.
Damon, we're going to bring this conversation to a close for now, but there are still many, many great topics that I want to chat with you about in future.
Again.
We got to talk about.
Yeah.
Yes, me too. So I've got one more question for you. It's not an easy one, all right. But Damon, as a respected elder in our national pagan community, like any good elder, I'm sure that you're considering the importance of one day passing on your flame, the flame that you've ignited, to the next generation. If you could offer a message to the next generation of pagans and freedom fighters and religious advocates in South Africa, what would your message be?
Well, as far as SAPA is concerned, I know that our executive committee is dedicated to human rights advocacy and religious equality. And if I die, they'll be there. That work will continue. There will always be a need for that. And hopefully we will have hundreds and hundreds of paralegals, community paralegals, who will be able to descend on a village when somebody's being accused of being a witch, because that would be my dream, to see that happening. But I also hope that the Pagan Council will broaden its pagan representation, take its rightful place as an equal representative of a religion in this country, serve on interfaith councils, be recognized by non-pagans. I also hope that pagans everywhere find common cause and common ground. I hope that they're able to look beyond their own insecurity and realize that if they work with someone else, they don't necessarily have to give up their autonomy. They can cooperate and remain autonomous, because that's what I'm doing. That's what you're doing. That's what a lot of people I know are doing. If we can find common ground and work together, I know we can create an amazing future for pagans, not just for pagans, but for non-pagans too.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Damon Leff, for being here with us today. I'm very excited to have shared this time with you. Stay blessed, and until we chat again, see you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us on Roots and Resonance. May the voices you have heard today continue to echo in your heart. I would also like to thank our sponsors, Afrishanti Wellness, Gogo's Garden Apothecary, the Circle of the Silver Baobab, and the South African Pagan Council. If these conversations nourished you, then please share this podcast, like and subscribe, and we hope that you will walk with us again in future episodes. Until then, stay rooted and stay resonant.